It's the good old days. Communications in this episode. Our lens, this gold rush era letter from San Francisco, 1850. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the good old days. I am your host, Kevin Costner. Thank you for being here. Today's episode, communications, a subject close to my heart. Now, before I started filming, I sent a text to my aunt outside of Boston, and a few seconds later, I received a response. Now, something a little bit different from that text. Let me read you this. I see Mr. William Norwood most every day. He has been to the mines and I suppose has done very well. He showed me the other day $800 worth of gold that he dug himself. Father has bought a small schooner of 100 tons named the Roanoke, and I guess she will do very well, for schooners are the best property. The cost, $10,000, the same price that he sold the ship for. So my message, a few seconds between Vegas and Boston. This letter, written in the 19th century between San Francisco and outside of Boston, not so quick. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk in more detail about this letter. We're going to compare it to the text I sent, and we're going to talk about communications in the good old days. But first, we have to go to the wall. The wall. And those are maps on the wall. Plug for an upcoming episode of the good old days where we will be covering the GPS of the good old days. So, sent a text a moment ago to my aunt in Boston. Took a few seconds to get there. She responded back, a couple seconds more. I said, hey, 7 seasons, binge watched Game of Thrones in 30 days. Her response, get a life, LOL. She's sort of right. Anyway, let's take a look at the distances we're talking about. Keeping with the no-tech method of the good old days here. This is going on. The source of the text. Destination of the text. Over here in Boston. Quite a distance. Still took a few seconds back and forth. In fact, we've become so accustomed to this immediacy of communications that we get frustrated or angry or even concerned if we don't get a response back near immediately. Now, it might be the words, right? Oh, my words, the emotion in the words wasn't right, and the person now is angry at me and will not talk to me for days. Sound familiar? Not in 1850, in the 19th century. Communication was by something called letters. People wrote them. That's obviously the focus of this episode. That's the actual letter that I am talking about. It's from T.T. Lane to his aunt, Miss Ann Phippen, who was in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And very delicate. It's obviously in protective plastic. I did make some blow-ups. I wanted to show you this. This is the actual address section of the letter. It was folded up and mailed that way back in those days. Postage, cancel mark, and the amount of postage paid, 40 cents, about $21 in today's money. What's interesting is the San Francisco post office had only opened about 8 or 9 months before this letter was mailed. So now the next question is, so how did that letter get to Gloucester, Massachusetts? So let's remove one map and reveal the second map, which is the world map. And as much as I'd like to cover the geography of the entire world in this episode, we won't. Let's just focus on this, North and South America. And you can see there's some lines there. So let's examine what those lines are all about. The letter was written in San Francisco. Goes to the post office. From the post office, it goes on a steamship. Yes, steamship. It sails all the way down here to where? Panama. Who knows what the Panama is? Yes, where the Panama Canal is, but that did not exist for over another half century. So off the boat the mail comes, gets on canoes or pack animals, zips across the 50 miles of the Isthmus of Panama to the other side where, guess what? Back on a steamship. Steamship goes zooming, zooming, all the way up to probably Havana. Normally stopped there. Sometimes it also stopped up here in New Orleans, and then down around the tip of Florida, all the way up the East Coast to Massachusetts. And guess what? We've just been sailing and transporting mail for a couple months at least, maybe longer, depending upon weather. Possibility of the steamships being sunk by bad weather as well. Miss Phippen gets the letter. If she responded, we don't know. She writes the letter all the way back in reverse, 2-3 months more. So T.T. Lane, if that person did receive a response, it was 4 to 6 months after they wrote the letter. Now, in 1855, an intrepid investor did build a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama. And at the time, that was amazing technological revolution because it shortened the time of that trip to 3 weeks. That was astounding in the day. But that was 5 years after this letter was written. Also in 1851, they started some overland routes, and the mail would come out of St. Joe, Missouri, end up here in Salt Lake City, where then some very courageous men who were paid $14,000 a year back then to ride the mail from Salt Lake City to Sacramento. Very dangerous territory because of Indian situations. In fact, a man named Absalom Woodward, one of the very first to ride, in November 1851, didn't make it. His body was found the following April. So one other major thing that did occur, but didn't occur for many years, of course, was the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. And when that was built, a lot of what we're talking about changed dramatically, because now you had regularly scheduled mail arriving on a train that was quick, again, very quick, a fraction of the multiple months it was taking in 1850. So we're going to wrap up this discussion with some more comments, and we're going to have a brief conversation about what happened when the telegraph was invented and how that created what is called the Victorian Internet. Communications is something we all take for granted today. That was crystallized for me this past summer when my daughter was on a month-long European adventure, and she had a 16-hour stopover in Reykjavik, Iceland. Check that out on the globe. Pretty remote place. In that 16 hours, she spent every minute exploring that country, and she ended up in a place called the Blue Lagoon, which is a gorgeous place of hot springs. She Skype called me while I was jogging on the beach in Huntington Beach, California. It stopped me in my tracks. While standing in the shade of a building housing bathrooms on the beach, I Skype chatted live with my daughter from one of the least remote places on Earth to one of the most remote places on Earth. It was mind-blowing. It made me start questioning communications that we have today and how amazing it is that we can communicate and connect with people over vast distances immediately. It also started making me ask, what is immediate and how much more immediate can things get? As my example a moment ago with the text to my aunt in Boston, if you don't get a response immediately to a text, what's the normal reaction people have today? They get angry, they get worried. There's a visceral reaction because they didn't get a response now. So how important is now? When did now become the norm? When did it become business as usual that you had to be responsive immediately? How fast can things accelerate? How much faster than immediate can we get to before the system collapses? Now, back in the 19th century, when T.T. Lane wrote this letter to his aunt outside of Gloucester, months of transfer time, months of delay was normal. It was just expected. And if they didn't get a response, they wrote another letter. Now, this was across an entire country. Now, even city to city or town to town, separated by only 10 or 20 miles, it was hours and hours to communicate because you either walked or rode from town to town or wrote a letter and found someone that was going to the town to deliver it. So the immediate was at least hours and hours, maybe a day at the least. Imagine going across the ocean. Now, the steamships traveled along the coast. Imagine going across the Atlantic Ocean. I write a letter from Massachusetts back in the 19th century to London. It has to go on a ship. It has to go across a big ocean. And that's months of delay. Now, this all changed dramatically when the telegraph was invented in the 19th century. Now, there's a fantastic book I recommend everyone read. It's called The Victorian Internet. It brings together the fact that the real internet revolution was not in the 1990s. It was back in the 19th century when the telegraph was invented. Because here's what happened. For the first time in the history of the world, countries were connected together. The world went from being these different countries that had little connection to one another to one big world. Globalism that we talk about today was born with the invention of the telegraph. You see, telegraph wires were strung everywhere. They even were put under the oceans to connect countries. And you could take a message to a telegraph office. They would transcribe the message, send it over the telegraph to the receiving end. It would be decoded and delivered. Literally within the same day, you could get a response to your message. So where the letter from 1850 Gold Rush San Francisco took months, if a telegraph existed back in 1850, it would have been the same day probably to get a response from the aunt outside of Gloucester. That was mind-blowing at the time. The world shrunk instantly. That was the revolution that started the communications that exist today, back with the telegraph.
So we need to maybe appreciate that more. Step back, slow it down a little bit. Recognize that maybe whenever, soon enough. And if it gets to be a little bit too much, maybe we need to take a couple steps back. And next time you want to communicate with a friend or loved one, you know what? Write a letter. It's the good old days.